well. And my sister actually said, one of my three sisters, bring a bucket in case your water breaks. I hope that won't happen. I'm confident I will make it through the evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's very good for me to be part of this community lecture for the Center of Jewish Studies. And I've been looking forward to this evening, and it's good to see all of you. As Rebecca said, I have been teaching Hebrew Bible for a while now, first in Oslo and here at the University of Minnesota. And I've been teaching Hebrew Bible maybe for around 12 years. And my book from 2008 did focus on the gendered God language in the Hebrew Bible. Still, after all this time, the God language in the Hebrew Bible, the way the Hebrew Bible talks about God, and how God talks about God's self, is one of the most fascinating things for me with the Bible and the ancient Israel's belief in God. Just listen to this. Adonai goes forth like a soldier. Like a warrior, he stirs up his fury. He cries out, he shouts aloud. He shows himself mighty amongst his foes. For a long time I have held my peace. I have kept still and restrained myself. No, I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. In only 2 small verses in the book of Isaiah, God has been described as a soldier, a warrior, a mighty one. And further, God has described him or herself as a woman in labor, screaming, gasping, and panting in labor pain. God is a warrior and a woman in labor. We are transported from the battlefield to the delivery room. Frederick Geiser, now a retired professor of Old Testament studies at Luther Seminary here in St. Paul, he once gave a list of the ways God is portrayed in the second part of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 40-55. And Geiser writes, among other things, God is portrayed as a redeemer, savior, maker or potter, rock, warrior, woman in labor, shepherd, friend, helper, lover, rear guard, mother, father, nurse, husband, and walker. Imagine how long that list would be if we did this for the whole Bible. God is potter, rock, shepherd, lover, mother, and father. At the same time, we know that the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition strongly argue that God should not be depicted in any form. And we can find a classical formulation of this in Deuteronomy 4, verse 15 to 18. Since you saw no form when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire, take care and watch yourself closely, so that you do not act corruptly by making an idol for yourself in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps upon the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. God should not be depicted in any form, because you saw no form when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb. The logic is God doesn't have any form. You didn't see a form of God, so you cannot make any images of God in any form or figure. What is not prohibited, though, is making images of God in and through language. The Hebrew Bible is full of images in language, or as Rabbi Neil Gilman calls them in his book Believing and Its Tensions, the Hebrew Bible is full of word pictures. Word picture is a good term because it emphasizes that words create pictures, pictures for God. And it's these pictures that we shall look together on tonight. I still choose to use the term God language, though, because God language emphasizes that we are working with language and texts, and that images and concepts of God that are created are embedded in that language. When I use the term God language, I talk about all language for God, whether it refers to God or God's actions in the Hebrew Bible, like Adonai goes forth like a soldier, or whether it occurs in a liturgical text, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King or ruler of the universe. God language is not literary descriptions of God. Of course, for us, the question would be immediately whether it's in fact possible for us to refer to God with language, or even the question, does God exist? But for the Hebrew Bible authors, it was taken for granted that God and also other deities exist and were active. The question was who this God was and how this God was. My fundamental understanding of the God language in the Hebrew Bible and in later writings and in liturgy is that all God language is metaphorical language. God language is formulated in metaphors, similes, analogies. And metaphorical language is especially helpful when one is to talk about God. As Rabbi Gilman writes, metaphor enables us to see the unseen, hear the unheard, and grasp the ungraspable. See the unseen, hear the unheard, and grasp the ungraspable. A biblical scholar called Sarah Diller, she formulates it as follows: all speech and even thought about God is necessarily metaphorical or analogical. We will spend some time this evening looking at many examples of the God language of the Hebrew Bible, many examples of the diverse metaphors used for God. But first I will introduce some basic metaphor theory and terminology that I have found helpful while working with this language, and many of these quotes you will have on your handout. Janet M. Sotsky defines metaphors as follows, quote, metaphor is that figure of speech whereby we speak about one thing in terms which are seen to be suggestive to another, end of quote. This means that God language talks of God in a language and in concepts that are usually used in other contexts. As an example of a Hebrew Bible metaphor for God, we can look at the well-known formulation, Adonai is my shepherd, Adonai ro'i. It is not the word shepherd in Psalm 23 verse 1, which is the metaphor. And we cannot simply exchange or substitute the word shepherd with a more literal statement to get the meaning of the metaphor. The whole formulation, Adonai is my shepherd, is the metaphor or the metaphorical utterance. Today, scholars who work with metaphor theory usually refers to the two elements or two thoughts in the metaphor, and they refer to them as a source or a source domain, and a target domain. Target is the one we talk about. We aim to talk about the target. And here, Adonai is the target. Adonai is my shepherd. We are trying to say something about God. And in all God language, God is the target. The aim is to talk about God. When we look at the source domains in the Hebrew Bible, though, they vary a lot. In Adonai is my shepherd, shepherd is the source. God is talked of in language connected to shepherds. In the metaphor God our Father from Isaiah 63, Father is the source. In the Hebrew Bible we find anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, and physiomorphic source domains in the language used for God. God is talked of as a human, as an animal, and as nature. And I will look into all of these later on. The meaning of a metaphor is usually understood to be found in the interaction between the source and the target. In the metaphorical utterance, Adonai is my shepherd, there is an interaction between shepherds and all the associations of shepherds on the one hand, and God on the other hand. The meaning of the metaphor is created in this meeting between the source language, the shepherd, and God. The reader or the listener sees or hears hears God through the lens of the shepherd. The meaning is a new meaning, and the metaphor cannot be substituted with a literal expression. The metaphor constructs an image or a concept of God. You can turn your hand up to page 2 if you like, so you know where we are. Metaphors are one main way of talking about God in the Hebrew Bible. Another very common way of talking about God is through comparisons or similes. The presence of the little word like in an utterance is the school book criterion that we have a simile and not a metaphor. And similes in the Hebrew Bible are usually introduced with ke, or kmo, masal, or sometimes im, and they all will be translated like something. The title of this talk quotes a simile or a comparison from the book of Hosea. I will devour them like a lion. Hosea 13:8. God is the one speaking, and God compares God's self to a lion. In recent debates on metaphors, a lot of scholars see metaphor and similes not merely as two different linguistic expressions, but are using one or the other implies a conceptual difference. The claim seems to be that there is a referential difference between similes and metaphors. Metaphors are somehow understood to be closer to the referent than similes. This discussion has been especially pointed in the liturgical debate of God language. Can one in a liturgical setting pray to God our Mother, Imenu? Or must we limit ourselves to compare God to a mother? I will not spend a lot of time on this debate today. I just want to say that I agree with those scholars who argue, as Janet Merritt Soskin does, that the little word like in many similes is an aspect of superficial grammar and in no way impedes meaning. To me, similes and metaphors basically seem to work the same way. And if we look at the Hebrew Bible, which we are doing tonight, we find several examples on one particular source domain used to talk about God, and it's used both in similes and in metaphors. Similes and metaphors are used interchangeably. We have already seen that in Psalm 23:1, there is the use of shepherd as a source language in the God language. Adonai is my shepherd. Shepherd is used in a metaphor. We find the same source used also in a comparison, in a simile, for example in Isaiah 40 verse 11. Like a shepherd, keh broi. He tends to his flock, he gathers the lambs in his arms, he carries them in his bosom. Keh bro'eh, like a shepherd. Here is a simile with a shepherd, and the shepherding is the source, and the target is Adonai in both examples. And I cannot see that there is a difference in closeness between God and the shepherd in Psalm 23 and Isaiah 40. In both cases, there is an invitation to the reader or to the listener to relate the two domains to each other. For you are our Father. Though Abraham does not know us and Israel does not acknowledge us, you, Adonai, are our Father. Our Redeemer from old is your name. In this example from Isaiah 63:16, God our Father is formulated in a metaphorical utterance. Father is used in a metaphor. While in Psalm 103 verse 13, Father is used in a simile. As a father has compassion for his children, so Adonai has compassion for those who fear him. We have a comparison, but again, Father is the source. In both these examples, God is a father, and God is not literally a father. Both with similes and metaphors, there is a tension between an is and is not. And by the way, in a parenthesis, the word father, av, is used about 1,200 times in the Hebrew Bible, and only 12 to 15 times is it used about God as Father. So God as Father is actually much more limited in the Hebrew Bible than we usually think about. It explodes later on. Both in Jewish tradition and in Christian tradition, father becomes like the main metaphor, but in the Hebrew Bible it's actually very limited. What else do we need to know about God language? For me, it is important to underline that God language is humans' language for God, and that this language draws on human experiences. A Swedish Bible scholar named Trygve Mettinger, he once formulated it as follows, quote, "These symbols speak of God, but do so in terms of categories drawn from the world of human experiences," end of quote. Neither Trygve Mettinger nor I would limit these experiences to some sectarian or religious experiences. The Hebrew Bible's authors talked about and wrote about God based in their experiences in life. This basis of the God language in experience is also one of the main reasons for the feminist criticism of the God language in the Jewish Christian tradition. Since most, if not all, of the Bible was formulated by men, and the tradition has been dominated by men, most of the God language reflects the male or men's experiences. One often talks about a shortened God language, and God language just covers some experiences and not the whole spectrum. And we will return to the feminist critique of the God language a little bit later on. Not only is the God language formulated based in experience, it also creates new experience. God language creates our ideas, our images, and our concepts of God. A Bible scholar called Bishops, he writes, quote, "My initial hypothesis is that not only experiences generate metaphors, but that metaphors also generate experiences," end of quote. He argues for this hypothesis by discussing Ezekiel's wedding metaphors, and he writes, once more I quote, "Apparently the prophets did not want to tell something about something, but to achieve something in their addressee's mood. The metaphor seems to have a pragmatic function," end of quote. The metaphor is used to achieve something in the addressees. It creates new experiences. And Bishop continues, "In the so-called religious experiences, we see, feel, and hear what we already know. Those experiences do not generate the words describing this knowledge, but the words we know generate that which we hear, feel, and smell." So there is like a dialectic movement. We formulate, and the Hebrew Bible authors formulate God language based in their experience. And when they formulate new language, that new language will again generate new experiences of God. So there is like a dialectic movement between them. When the Hebrew Bible authors used a new metaphor, a new image for God for the first time, it could open up for a new concept of God, a new understanding of God. And this further might mean that their readers or listeners would experience God in a new way. I believe that our God language that we use today in synagogue or in churches or in liturgical contexts achieve the same thing. One big challenge, though, that I'm sure some of you have been met with is that, especially when one talks with people one-to-one in counseling, or whether you give a devour Torah or when you teach, what you try to say about God is not necessarily what the people hear that you are saying. Because people would have their own concepts of God, and they will have their own experiences, and they will filter what you say through those experiences. So even if we try to say something and we intend to have a special meaning with that metaphor, the people could have a very different understanding. A Norwegian psychologist called Susanne Sønderbo, she has pointed out how many people confuses or mistakes their own concept of God, their own ideas about God, with God with capital G. And that they do not reflect over the fact that their concepts or ideas about God might be just one way of imagining God and not God as such. Bible scholar, because I'm primarily a Bible scholar, of course the primary concern and focus of mine is to study and understand the God language in the Hebrew Bible. And that's what I do usually. But I'm also concerned as a religious person or active in a synagogue how these concepts of God and how the language we use creates new ideas or closest new ideas for the understanding of God. So I'm here today both speaking as a Bible scholar and a little bit like a more additional to Bible scholar. I don't know what you call it, religious person. When we spent the year in Israel, saying that you were religious somehow meant that you were like Haredi or something. So it's really not a very good term to use, but I think you know where I'm from. Okay, so that was like the introduction in the theory thing, and now we're going to look at the different images of God in the Hebrew Bible, and we're on point number 3, the riches and challenges of the God language in the Hebrew Bible. This semester I'm teaching 2 courses at the University of Minnesota, and in one of them, Prophecy in Ancient Israel, we've been talking a lot about God language as we have been reading the book of Hosea over the last weeks. In Hosea, the students met all the different categories of God language and also some of the major challenges for today's readers of the Hebrew Bible's God language. And the main categories of God language I have already mentioned. Anthropomorphic language, God portrayed as a human. Theriomorphic or zoological morphic language, God portrayed as an animal. And physiomorphic language, God as nature or a phenomenon. And let's start with the last one. Usually in the Hebrew Bible, the physiomorphic metaphors about God is God as rock or fortress, as in Psalm 31:3. You are indeed my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Or God as a dwelling place, as in Psalm 90, verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. So that rock, God is the rock, God is the castle, God is the dwelling place. Good, safe metaphors. But in Hosea 5, we found 2 very strange source domains used to talk about God in 2 similes. God is portrayed as maggots and rottenness. Therefore, I am like maggots to Ephraim and like rottenness to the house of Jacob. I'm not going to go into how we understood that in the end, but whatever we do with it, it's not a very friendly or charming image of God that these texts constructs. The theriomorphic images, or the zoological images for God, are also very frequently used in Hosea. But in Deuteronomy we read, so that you do not act corruptly by making an idol for yourself, in the likeness of any animal that is on earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, and so on. But in the language, God is frequently portrayed as an animal, or more so as many different animals. In Hosea 13 it says, Yet I have been the Lord your God ever since the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and besides me there is no Savior. So I will become like a lion to them. Like a leopard I will lurk beside the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and I will tear open the covering of their heart. There I will devour them like a lion, as a wild animal who mangled them. Lion, leopard, she-bird, I will devour them like a lion. A rather passionate and rather terrifying image of God. The theriomorphic language does not have to be terrifying and violent, though. They can also describe God's compassion, as in Deuteronomy 32. He sustained him in the desert. In a howling wilderness waste, he shielded him, cared for him, guarded him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stares up its nest and hovers over its young, as it spreads its wings out, takes them up and bears them aloft on its piers. Imagine being carried by God's eagle's wing, resting on God's feathered wings. Maybe the most challenges of the God language categories are actually the anthropomorphic images. Images for God as a person, and now we're on page 3. Because somehow it seems much easier to say that God a lion or God a rock are not literal descriptions of God, but metaphors pointing in direction of some traits that God has. But when we talk about God as father, a judge, or a king, we often seem to forget that we're still working with metaphors. When we start talking about anthropomorphic images, we also need to raise the question about gender. And many feminist scholars have been very critical, as I said, to the Jewish Christian tradition because of the domination of the male God language, the male metaphors for God. And if we do count, and sometimes I do count, through the Hebrew Bible, it's clear that the male metaphors are way more dominant than the feminine ones. King, ruler, husband, etc., etc. Since the 1970s and the second wave of feminism, there has been a search for the so-called feminine elements in the Godhead, both in language, but also in archaeology and history of religion. How was it really in ancient Israel? Did one also worship goddesses? How is it really in the language? Is God only presented as male? So this search for the feminine Godhead has been going on since the 1970s, of course also way before, but this is like in the established biblical scholarship. And this search for the feminine Godhead has shown that there actually are some feminine metaphors for God also in the Hebrew Bible. But first, what is male and female God language? What is gendered in this context? How do we identify it? In my definition, gendered God language is all language which awakens associations to gender and thus construct an idea of gender for the reader. Further, I have a criteria saying that gender must be part of the source domain of the metaphor. So, gender can be explicitly present in the source language as in God our Father. Father, king, husband, they are all referring to male sex or to the masculinity, and it's somehow implicitly included in the source. So all these metaphors would be explicitly marked for male gender. Gender can also be implicit presented in a source, when gender is part of the social construct of what is male or female, masculine or feminine. In the Hebrew Bible, we hear primarily of men being soldiers. This is not necessarily so. There is no biological reason that women couldn't be soldiers, and today a lot of women are soldiers. But since men are primarily soldiers in the Hebrew Bible, there is a social construct of maleness in that metaphor. So when God is talked about as a man of war, this is implicit marked of male gender. On the other hand, there were only women midwives in ancient Israel. So when God is portrayed as a midwife, even though men could also be midwives, in ancient Israel and in the Hebrew Bible, that would be a feminine God metaphor. God as a midwife indicates God behaving in a female role, and is therefore an example of a feminine gendered God language. The source language can also be non-gendered, so it could be not give any association to gender at all, or it could give association in both directions and therefore be ambiguous. In our example metaphor, Adonai is my shepherd, this is an example of a non-gendered source. Since both women and men can be shepherds, and in the Hebrew Bible we hear about both men and women being shepherds, and thus it is gendered ambiguous. So to some examples of the female God language. From the 1970s and onwards, one has searched for feminine God language, and one finds some of them in the Hebrew Bible. God is portrayed as a woman in labor in Isaiah 42:14. This we saw already. In Psalm 22 and Psalm 71, God is portrayed as a midwife who picks up the baby at birth. In Isaiah 66, God is portrayed as a comforting mother, and also in Isaiah 66:13. In Isaiah 46, verse 3, God can be seen as a pregnant woman who carries her baby Israel from the time the baby was in the womb. God lifts the baby up as a midwife and continues to carry Israel till it becomes old and grey. So God is somehow carrying the baby all the time from the womb, through pregnancy, at birth, until the baby becomes old and grey. As you will quickly recognize, most of these female metaphors are connected to being a mother or in the process of giving birth. And for many, this has been seen as a very limited image from a feminist point of view, that somehow women are only portrayed as mothers and giving birth. And that's a legitimate critique. But at the same time, it's clear that from an ancient Israel point of view again, an historical context, being a mother and giving birth and having children was one of the main female experiences in ancient Israel. You probably all remember Rachel saying, "Give me children or I will die." The understanding and need of children is so strong in the culture that somehow giving birth and having children is one of the main experiences for women. There is one text from Hosea, to return to Hosea, that was long seen as an image of God as a father. But in recent times, one has asked if this text maybe actually portrayed God as a mother and the things mothers do. And so the study Bible then often ends up saying this is God as a parent, because if he was a father and now maybe he's a mother, and then we say God as a parent. So it covers everything. Hosea 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yet I was the one who taught Ephraim to walk. I took him up in my arms, but I did not know that I healed them. I led them with the cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. I have also listed some more texts on the parent-child metaphor on your handout if you want to look at them later on. So the father-son, the mother-child, the parent-child metaphor is a very powerful anthropomorphic language and image in the Hebrew Bible. Another example of anthropomorphic God language that has been seen much more problematic is the very gendered language that the marriage metaphor represents. The relationship between God and Israel seen as a marriage between a man and a wife. And again, Hosea is the primal text, the starting point of the marriage metaphor in the Hebrew Bible. In Hosea 1, it says, "When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, 'Go take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord.' So he went out and took Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son." And then later on God says, "Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts. Or I will strip her naked, and expose her in the day, as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and turn her into a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I have no pity, because they are children of whoredom, for their mother has played a whore, she has conceived them, and has acted shamefully." In this marriage metaphor, God is the husband, gendered male, and Israel, the wife, is gendered female. But it's not only the gendering here that is challenging, it's the stereotypical idea of the woman as the whore, as the sinners and the promiscuous, and the husband being the violent husband who sends her away and then takes her back and sends her away. The violent character of the marriage imagery is very present in the Hebrew Bible. And to make sense of the marriage metaphor, we have to see it in the context of ancient Israel once more, where marriage was patrilineal. You belonged to your father, and then you were married off, and you belonged to your husband. Marriage was patrilocal. You moved from your father's house into the house of the husband. And in addition, there is an importance of shame and honor in this culture, and especially in marriage, where women's behavior would shame the man. So all these things has to be taken into account when we read Hosea. We can't somehow put Hosea into our Western egalitarian marriage ideal. It really doesn't fit. There are other examples of the marriage metaphor in the major prophets, and I've listed them on your handout, but most of them are very problematic. The husband is really punishing and sending away the wife, and she is the sinner, and it's really a very problematic, from my point of view, image in the Hebrew Bible. These were some examples of all the diverse metaphors that you can find in the Hebrew Bible and some of the challenges that it meets us with. And I'm going to sum up with some perspectives in point 4 from the Hebrew Bible till today's God language, some lines of thoughts. And then you are free to ask and protest and do whatever you like, basically. What does the Hebrew Bible achieve with such a multitude of metaphors for God? And can these metaphors contribute to our own formulation of God language today? First of all, I think that a multitude of metaphors for God reflects a multitude of experiences. When we use several different sources in the God language, this is a way of avoiding the shortened God language that the feminist movement talked about. And when we use a multitude of metaphors for God, we include more people's life experiences. There is also a danger in using just one or a very limited number of metaphors for God. A danger that American theologian and scholar Sally Faig has pointed out. She argues that if we say only one thing about God, the God language loses the metaphorical status, and it becomes a name, a model, and even idolatry. And to prevent this, she says, we need to talk about God in a diverse language. Further, the Hebrew Bible combines a huge amount of metaphors that are inconsistent. They would talk about God as a lion, a leopard, and a bear in the same verse. They would talk about God as first a father and then a husband. And they would somehow put together inconsistent metaphors that for us as modern readers are very strange. But when they do that, they underline very strongly that we are talking about metaphorical language. A Bible scholar called Kirsten Nielsen, she writes, quote, "These words of prayer," and she's referring to Psalm 18, "these words of prayer are typical for the way God is addressed in the Psalter. God is addressed as a person who can hear prayers and react on them, and at the same time, God is described as something impersonal, as a rock, a fortress, etc. The reason for this combination of personal, anthropomorphic, and impersonal language is that the author uses metaphors, not only when God is described as a rock, but also when God is described as a human being who can love and be talked to." And she continues, "The impersonal metaphors thus help us deconstruct our all too narrow ideas about God. And the personal metaphors help us to reconstruct a conception of God which makes prayers possible and meaningful." End of quote. In other words, she says that having all these different categories, the personal metaphors, the anthropomorphic metaphors, the nature metaphors, the zoomorphic metaphors, God as animal, they do different things. They deconstruct a narrow image of God, saying that, okay, this is God. And at the same time, they open up and reconstruct a broader image of God. The personal metaphor makes us be able to talk to God and pray to God and feel loved by God. While God as a rock and a fortress makes us, okay, I can just be here, I don't need to interfere too much with this personal God, I can just have God as a rock here and that's okay. So they function in different ways and somehow gives different needs. The Hebrew Bible also mixes male and female metaphors, as we have seen. And that makes it much harder to understand one gender as decisive for God's gender. Elizabeth Johnson wrote once with good reason, quote, If it's not meant that God is male when masculine imagery is used, why the objection when female images are introduced? If it's not meant that God is male when masculine imagery is used, why the objection when female images are introduced? Finally, to underline the idea that God cannot be compared to anything or anyone, one needs to use a multitude of images for God. In Isaiah 40-66, God is over and over again said to be different and incompatible, not comparable to anyone. Adonai is said to be the only God, or at least the only true God, but in this text corpus we also find a multitude of different metaphors. And Mark Brettler has commented on this, writing, quote, "The anonymous prophet says, 'To whom then can you compare me? To whom can I be likened?' says the Holy One," over and over and over again in Isaiah. Within Isaiah 40-66, this statement presents us with a wonderful irony. This is one of the Hebrew Bible's strongest statements concerning the incomparability of Adonai. Yet it is found within a literary corpus which is particularly rich with comparisons for Adonai. End of quote. So in the book of Isaiah, chapter 40 and onwards, we find a huge amount of different God language, all the different categories of God languages, similes and metaphors. And we saw that in the beginning of this talk, where I quoted Isaiah 42, where God is a man of war and a woman in labor at the same time. It seems as this fact, this huge multitude of metaphors, drive this other point home, that God cannot be compared to anything or anyone. I think that we can and should speak of God in a multitude of metaphors and images. It seems that to be able to say that God is Father, but not literally a father, to be able to say that God is God, and not a father, mother, woman, king, shepherd, rock, or lion, we have to use all the images that are available to us and say that God is father, mother, woman, man, king, shepherd, rock, and lion. On the last page of your handout, I have included some bibliographical references. This is not an exhaustive list at all, so if you're interested in more references, do not hesitate to contact me or send me an email. I have also included a little Calvin and Hobbes line. That's from my teaching. I used to put them there, even on the quizzes and the midterms, I put these little Calvin and Hobbes things. And sometimes I find them often very provoking and profound, and sometimes they're just silly, so you can see what you think. What if we die and it turns out God is a big chicken? What then? Actually, in the Hebrew Bible, God is never portrayed as a chicken. God is an eagle and other birds, but God as a chicken, or Jesus as a chicken, doesn't appear before in the New Testament. That's a different story. Thank you. The Hebrew Bible is not exceptional here. This is a very common, also in the ancient Near East, you will find texts. Yeah. No, it's not just in the Bible. You would find this kind of imagery used in the whole ancient Near East and in lots of other cultures. So this is not specific for the Hebrew Bibles. In that sense, I would say it's like a general religious thing that people do. They would talk about God in ways that reflect their experiences. This is it, yes. And that is different in the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish and Christian tradition. The Christian tradition started out not making images of God, but then it's changed. From around 300 Common Era, there was a huge discussion about whether you can portray Jesus or not, and then they said you can portray Jesus as a man, not as divine, and then somehow it changed. So today, there are not very often portraits of God the Father in the Christian tradition, but there's no hesitation presenting Jesus. The Jewish tradition was exceptional, both in the Hebrew Bible and later, not making forms and figures of God. Which I think you're right, that if one did that, it's easy to say, God is like this. But if you use a huge amount of different metaphors, then you don't trap God somehow into one form. That's a good point. yes, there are many interesting discussions about the name of God and what it actually means, and also especially the tetragrammaton, which we use Adonai to say. We don't say the tetragrammaton, it is not in liturgical context. So there's a huge discussion about that, and also in feminist studies, El Shaddai has been understood to get God as a God with breasts. So there are many things you can discuss with that. God as makom is not in the Bible, God as the place. So if there's someone with rabbinical specialties here who can help me out, I would be happy. Okay, I can't answer it, I'm sorry. But so it's later, it's not in the Bible. But the idea that God is present in a special place is really in the Bible, that God is connected to the temple, to Zion, to Jerusalem. I actually would say I know how it happened in Christianity, I'm not sure how it happened in Judaism. So, again, in the Hebrew Bible, God the Father is used very seldom. In the beginning, God is the father of the king. So God has a father-son relationship with the king. And later it seems to be democratized, you say that? Democratized. God is father for the people. And then you get these things in Isaiah, late part of Isaiah, God is our father, you are our father. And it seems to become more and more personal. And it enters the New Testament discourse and the early rabbinic texts and thinking in the same time. And when I did my PhD in Norway, I had to give a public lecture on the New Testament about John. And John uses God the Father 121 times in the Gospel of John. So in the whole Hebrew Bible, we have like 12 to 15 times, and in the Gospel of John, 121 times. And the thing in John is actually not, the whole point is not to say that God is Father, but that Jesus is the Son. So there the image of God as Father is part of the Christology. And what happens in Judaism at the same time, I'm not really sure about, but there is something about this democratization idea. They also have argued that there is a shift in religious practice during the exile, because you didn't have the temple anymore, you didn't have the sacrifices, you get the start of what becomes a synagogue service, and it's more family-oriented, and some scholars argue that this is the time when we start to use the more personal, intimate metaphors, God as Father, and then also you get more of the God as Mother metaphors. I'm not totally convinced by that, but there is some discussion, but I don't really know what happened in early Judaism, but that there is some development in it. That's clear, that has changed. So the liturgical movement has changed and been much more broader and making up new languages. So when I said there had been big discussion in liturgy, there has been some, in the beginning we used like the traditions language, and then you get all these questions about it being predominantly male, hierarchical, problematic sometimes, and what do we do? And some traditions like the Reconstructionist and also Reform has gone further in making new language. But then somehow you get into the question, when you make new language, you also probably maybe change the idea of God. and how do we do that, and what can we do? So then you end up in the whole God discussion. So what can we say whatever about God? Is God a chicken? So there is a huge challenge. I think we have to do it, but there is a huge challenge. Is there any limitation of how far we can go? But there has clearly been a movement over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Think here and then behind, yes.
I just wanted to point out that Jesus did refer to himself as a female chicken.
That is true. He's taking all the little chickens in under his wing, and God is a mother hen. So that's clearly, I can't remember the gospel now, and also in Jerusalem there is this big church where you have this image of Jesus as the hen with all the chickens. It's a good point. Yes. Hi.
Are there patterns, correlations in the types of metaphors, similes, so forth that are used by the different authors of the Hebrew Bible?
There is. There seems to be, I haven't studied this like in every book. The book I wrote my book on was Isaiah and the second part of Isaiah. And it's clear, for example, there that second Isaiah, we call it second Isaiah, it's 40 to 55, 40 to 66, the later part of the book of Isaiah, there is used much more feminine metaphors than anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And then one asks why. And one question is, maybe second Isaiah, which was not the first Isaiah, maybe second Isaiah was a woman. Which of course we think sometimes on and off, and it's a nice thought. I don't think it's true, but that's somehow, I don't think every time you speak nicely about a woman, it has to be a woman who writes it. I don't think it's so logical. But anyways, so that's one suggestion. The other suggestion is that we are now in exile in the time afterwards, and there is a change in the usage of God language, so the more democratic and personal and intimate language. A third suggestion has been that the threat of worshipping goddesses, like real goddesses in ancient Israel, was a less threat than that point. So that somehow the worship of Adonai has managed to shove aside all the goddesses, and now there's only one God, and that this one God could incorporate also the feminine language. As long as you had this huge struggle between the worship of God and Asherah and other goddesses in Israel, it was really dangerous to use feminine God language for Adonai. But when somehow God becomes bigger and bigger and gets more and more power and incorporates more of these other languages, then you could do that. So that's one theory. So you could see, and Hosea uses much marriage metaphors, primarily marriage metaphors, but then also these animals that we've seen. So you can see patterns. But why they do it, and it's probably part of the rhetorical strategy, the pragmatics of it. They need a certain metaphor and they use it a certain way. I would say yes and no. Most of the metaphors you find in the Hebrew Bible you can also find in the ancient Near East. Both the animal metaphors, the anthropomorphic metaphors, God is portrayed often very much similar to the other gods in the area. One thing that seems to, so at some level it's the same thing, but at the same time there are some things that they did not talk about God of the Bible as. So there was something that they somehow chose to leave out. And for a long time it seems to be, the feminine God language seems to be part of that. One thing that becomes more and more clear when you come down to exile and after exile, that the God of Israel incorporates more and more traits. So the ancient Near Eastern gods often was like one thing, the God of the storm or the God of that and God of that, more limited, and the God of Israel somehow took over more and more and more. And that strengthened this idea that God is different from everything else, but also God incorporates everything else. So yes and no. And I don't know enough about ancient Near Eastern material, but I know there are a huge amount of parallels. But at the same time, God in the Hebrew Bible seems to take over more and more. It's a very good question. There are languages that doesn't have he and she. I know a colleague of mine, he was reading, when I did my PhD, he was reading one of my papers, and I had example metaphor that said, she is a stargazer lily. And this poor guy was Finnish, well, he knew English, but he was Finnish, and in Finnish they don't have she or he, so it would be it, and he had no idea what a stargazer lily was. So how does he start understanding what his metaphor is? So I think it's clear that which personal pronoun we use do affect how we think. One of my nephews, he's 5 now, my sister would pray with him in the evening, and then he said, I also want to add something, and then he said, thank you God that you gave us this little brother. He's really keen about his little brother. And then he says, do you think she heard me? Do you think she heard my brain waves? And like, I don't know, I don't think my sister has talked about God as she, but he actually used she. So somehow I think that would say something about how you think. So but I don't know what will happen in the long run. I've had the same problems with students. I have made them read these texts from Isaiah, and they read, like a mother comforts her son, I will comfort you. And I ask, how is God portrayed? And they say, God is a father. And they just read, as a mother, I will comfort. So there is this, because that's how we always thought. But I don't know what will happen in the long run, but I think something will happen. I do have a master level exam also in the New Testament, and I did a lot of work on the New Testament when I had to do this exam. And the New Testament does have heavenly God language in a very, very limited way. There are a few examples, the chicken, the female hen, God as the chicken mother. There's also a comparison about God being like a woman who loses her coins and then looks for these coins, so God at some level is compared to this mother. But there are only like 2 or 3 examples. So when feminist Bible scholars, both Christian and Jews, were looking for this, they went to the Hebrew Bible, because in the Hebrew Bible you have it. If you don't have it in the New Testament, it kind of disappears. And the question is why? It could be because you get the development into the Trinity with the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, which ends up at least with 2 males, sometimes 3 males, sometimes 2.5 male. There are tendency in Christian tradition to talk about the Spirit as her, as she. So that there has been a development also there. So the New Testament actually, and the Christian tradition is more challenging because you have the Trinity and you have the Father and the Son. And can you change those categories without really threatening the whole dogma of the Trinity in God? And I think that people have tried it. There are several Christian scholars, especially Catholic scholars. Elizabeth Johnson, who wrote this wonderful book called She Who Is, where she's trying to talk about the possibilities of feminine God language also in Christian tradition. But I think there are challenges there that you don't have in Judaism. And at the same time you have Mary, and the idea of Mary being somehow not divine, but at least a little bit close maybe to divinity, and what kind of image does she represent? So there are other challenges. But it's clear that the Christian tradition and God the Father has been very dominant, and thus also constructed the whole idea of God as Father in general.
So my second question has
Yeah.
nothing to do with this.
Okay.
You showed 3 constructs that we look at God, nature,
Nature, animal, and human.
Yeah, it seems as a 4th category to comment on it, which is the notion of the Spirit.
Yeah.
Ruach Elohim, okay, God, the Spirit of God hovers over the water, and then the notion of Shekinah, which is the presence.
Yeah.
Those don't seem to fit into any of those categories.
Oh, that's true. I haven't thought about that. The spirit over the waters could be both the spirit and the wind. So Ruach could be both the spirit of God and the wind of God. And in the beginning, somehow it's very closely connected to God. But the Shekinah later on becomes somehow like a separate part of God, still God. And she is often presented as a female. But it's true, that doesn't really fit. I have to think about that. Good point. I don't think it always has to be male. The predominant idea that most people have is God being male, but there are a lot of, even if there are more of them, there are clearly feminine metaphors for God, also in the Hebrew Bible. And I think you have to use both of them. Because if you only use male metaphors, you reinforce this image of God being male. But if you mix them and use both male and female, you deconstruct the image of the male God. Because if you said God is mother and father, God can't just be male. God either have to be both or neither. I don't have an agenda saying that we have to change every people's image of God. I think what I was trying to take into account is that for a lot of people, many of these images of God has become problematic. And what do we do then? And one of the main questions for feminists was, if God is father, how do you relate to God if you have negative experience with your own father? So like sexual abuse or violence, how can you talk about God as father if all experience about fathers are bad? And then that was a starting point somehow, to start thinking about, are there other ways of talking about God? And some started talking about God as mother, which you have examples of, or someone started to talk about God as a friend, which you also have in the Bible, or God as a rock, which is less personal, so it's not so invasive. So you could find, in those situations, see if you can find other words for God that would make this person be able to connect to God, even if you have some bad experience with other things. But a friend of mine, or a colleague of mine, who's a professor of psychology or religion in Norway, he said, well, a lot of children have problems with their mothers as well. So God and mother is often not very helpful because you have this invasive Jewish mom who somehow doing all that. Somehow you don't want God to be your mother, and some people don't. So you have this. So I think it's important to think about, there is not a goal to change the image of God per se. The question in religious life and in counseling is, how can we talk about God in a way that helps people be able to connect to God if they wish to do that, and not close it off. That was one of the things I said in the beginning. Of course, for us as modern readers, the question would be, does God at all exist? And could we talk about God at all? And I'm not trying to pretend to have a good answer to that. But I think, yes, at some level you can say we don't know anything about God. And the only thing we can do is to try to talk about God in metaphors, so somehow it gives a hint of how God might be, if God exists. So you know, it's really, really tricky. So if you, I don't know if I'm going to go further than that to say that it is a really challenge. So if we can't say anything else about God than what we, in our own language, can say, and it's always a metaphor, what do we really know about God?